let's cross straight away to the briefing being held by the Matthews family in Johannesburg to discuss Donovan Moodley's possible parole.
Murdered, as well as problems in court as far as not having special rooms in which children could speak and testify, issues around minimum sentences and issues around DNA. So that's where you've traditionally heard our voices as women and men against child abuse. We're also dealing later on with teenagers who have been sexually abused and were not believed because of their age, and believed that these could have been consensual acts. We were also one of the first organizations that gave adult survivors a voice, cases in point being the Bob Hewitt and Sidney Frankel cases, and now, almost at the end of all of the criminal justice process, we are dealing with the parole system. What resulted from all these years of work, over 23 years, was a set of services provided to children and young people who had been abused in the past or who are currently being abused and had entered the criminal justice system. The services extend to their families and adult survivors, but all our services are primarily focused on victim support, and this is critical for what we are saying here today. We understand that there are primary victims and secondary victims. Primary victims are those harmed directly by the crime, like Leigh, who was murdered. Secondary victims are her parents, who have lost their daughter, and her sibling, Karen, who has lost her sister. Our job is to support them. We are holding this press conference in Youth Month because Leigh was a female youth who was robbed of the opportunity to be an adult. We must remember what our President said about protecting our female youth in the 5-point GBV plan in 2018. These key approaches to curbing GBV were prevention, strengthening the criminal justice system, enhancing the legal and policy framework, ensuring adequate care, support, and healing for victims of violence, and strengthening the economic power of women. Here we will be focusing on enhancing the legal and policy framework and ensuring adequate care, support, and healing for victims of violence. What we then realized was the need for support for victims, apart from the trauma of the event, was the secondary trauma caused by the system. Coming into that arena led us into two primary services. The first is preparing people for the process so they can have some level of agency over how they engage in this process. An example of that is our court preparation program. And after conviction, we are looking also now into the parole preparation, because it appears that the whole parole process is cloaked in some kind of mystery, wrapped up by our previous experience in the Hewitt matter with non-disclosure clauses and confidentiality clauses. These were clearly said at that hearing, and we do not believe that that is a reasonable thing. Our call here today is for an open parole hearing system where the public can participate, because this follows from an open justice system where the public can attend court. This will further be discussed by my colleague Luke. It becomes necessary for us during these press conferences to educate victims and their families, and in fact the public, in order for them to access and exercise their rights within the criminal justice system. Today is about education, about hearing the voice of the victim, and about our last element, which is to promote legislative change to protect victims in line with the President's gender-based violence program. Our focus is dual purpose: victim support and legislative reform. We are making that very clear. It is victim support and legislative reform, because the system is not victim-friendly. In fact, it is perpetrator-centric. I've given you a brief synopsis, as brief as we could, of the timeline of the Leigh Matthews case. It is available to all of you and starts from the 6th of July in 2004, when Donovan Moodley started preparing what was to be his kidnapping and then murder of Leigh Matthews, and goes right until 2010. So please, if you would all, and if there are any questions on that, Mr. Rob Matthews will answer those. So I'm handing over, thank you very much. I am handing over to Luke, head of our advocacy, who will look specifically at the processes victims, we believe, are coerced into, which appear to be in favour of convicted and sentenced rapists and murderers. Thank you very much.
Right, good morning, ladies and gents. I do have a prepared statement which I'm going to talk to, and everybody can have access to the written one. I can email it if you want. But the things I want to highlight relate to how victims are being treated, and that's primary and secondary victims, within the parole system by correctional services. As Miranda's highlighted, we have had huge issues around the victim-centric nature of our criminal justice system, and once that system is over, it appears very little shifts for the victims, and which is really what we're challenging today. So we all know that the murder of Leigh Matthews was contentious at the time of the trial. He made certain admissions. He was then convicted and sentenced. But at the centre of the controversy, as was stated by the judge, there was a belief that there was never full disclosure made by Mr. Moodley. In addition, Mr. Moodley has made alternative versions in one of the processes where he applied to have a retrial. He said, which was declined by the state, he said that there were other people involved. Then he didn't disclose who those people were because his application was unsuccessful. And what really, for me, has become concerning around that is initially paints himself as a victim of a system that was unfair and wrongfully convicted him, etc. Then he paints himself in some kind of heroic fashion, where what he's doing is he's protecting other people from the group of people who are allegedly responsible and masterminding this process. So right throughout, there is these alternative versions, and there's not taking full responsibility, not full disclosures. And why is this significant? It's significant because the Department of Correctional Services has, over a period of a few years, engaged the Matthews family in a restorative justice approach. And what I want to make very clear is that the approaches that are being proposed are within the restorative justice, alternative dispute resolution, judicial model. And those are things like victim-offender mediation. In this case, the victim is deceased. Victim-offender dialogues, the same. And now they're suggesting family group conferences for the families to come forward and engage in this process. The problem we have with this is that for me, who works extensively with restorative justice has certain conditions attached to it. The first of which is remorse. Remorse is absolutely essential. And then secondly, remorse with truth. In other words, a full disclosure. And Mr. Moodley would have to say, I did wrong, and in addition to that, this is the full story. The truth is absolutely essential here. To paraphrase Archbishop Desmond Tutu during the TRC hearings, you cannot be reconciled to something you do not know. And this, we know, within the TRC process has become a very contentious thing. Some people are very upset with the TRC process because they don't believe they got any truth. They don't believe they got full and final closure. They don't believe that they got to bury their deceased family. But other people do believe that they got some closure. So it's about how the system is run, but we have to take cognizance of the fact that there are preconditions for it. It's not just a blanket thing that happens because it's a process that has to happen. Okay. So what bearing does this family group conference, victim offender mediation, have on parole? Well, when the parole comes into place, and the parole hearing, which Peter will deal with extensively, as we have seen in other parole hearings, to qualify for parole and to be considered for early release and be held under correctional supervision or house arrest or whatever, there really does have to be for us evidence of rehabilitation. So we've got remorse, there needs to be truth, but there does have to be rehabilitation as well. and that for someone to be rehabilitated again, they have to admit authentically that they were guilty, they have to show remorse, and they have to give a full disclosure. And this is highly unlikely in the case of Mr. Moodley. So for us, the VOD process and the family group conference process that has been offered to the Matthews is retrofitting a process ahead of parole. And why the need for retrofitting is that certain processes have been followed so that the parole decision cannot then later be queried, as happened in the Hewitt matter. So the combination of restorative and parole processes that link to each other has significantly for us, and this is what we take great issue with, it has shifted the burden for keeping Mr. Moodley in jail back to the family. And that's really the problem, because when the criminal justice system goes and convicts somebody, it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the state has to prove it. Now, the state has to bring the victims in to show reasons why the accused, then convicted, then sentenced person does not get parole. It does not make any sense to us. And what has happened is that they have, in many ways, given the, well, not in many ways, in all ways, and Mr. Matthews will talk to it, very little preparation for the process, very little consultation with the family. It's always at the last minute, and there's lots of contradictory information that's getting sent out about this process. So it is our strong opinion that these interlinked processes do not take into account the feelings and perceptions of the victim, and therefore are not victim-centric as per the President's 5-point plan. It upholds the rights of the now convicted murderer over the rights and dignity of the victims and their surviving families, who must just participate in the process. And the one quote that really disturbed me was, otherwise the offender gets the upper hand. Now, how is it that in a restorative process you invite victims and surviving members of the family, and you tell them if you do not attend, the offender will get the upper hand? That doesn't make any sense to me. Okay. So, and that has been stated. So the family, in our opinion, are being coerced into this process, and recognizing that restorative justice is about restoring the person to themselves, restoring them to those they harmed, and restoring them to society at large. And it is the opinion of the Matthews, because I did talk to Mr. Matthews about that, that we do not believe that there's anything to restore between the family and the Matthews, between the Matthews family and Mr. Moodley. Okay. Simply, we just want justice, and justice is sentences handed down that are served as handed down. Further, it's our experience that there is almost a predetermined outcome to the parole hearings, like I experienced personally in the Bob Hewitt matter. And although the participants in the parole hearing were sworn to secrecy in the Hewitt matter, we know he had no remorse, nor was there any evidence from correctional services that he was rehabilitated. And we need to remember that the power of abuse lies in the secret, and we are deeply curious why correctional services would take on the pathology of its clients and the secrecy that they operate under. It felt abusive as the convicted rapist in the Hewitt matter and his legal representatives made disrespectful personal comments towards the victim and were allowed to do so by correctional service staff who did nothing to protect them. It is our belief that if parole is not granted, correctional services is seen as not having fulfilled their rehabilitative mandate, and shows that they have failed in their final mandate to rehabilitate those who have been put in their charge. They are not willing to concede this and swear the victim to silence so that they and their processes cannot be questioned. On the part of correctional services, one of the big questions we've asked in the previous parole hearing that we're involved in and this one is that what psychological tests have been carried out. And you will see we have posted a previous article about Minister Lamola saying that there has to be a psychiatrist and a criminologist, and there has to be all of these assessments that need to be done before people are released. That certainly did not happen in Mr. Hewitt's case, and we are challenging, and Mr. Matthews will talk to this, whether this is actually happening in Mr. Moodley's case. Okay. So the big thing is that we really concluding by saying we do not believe that correctional services is taking the broader interests of society into consideration. We recognise that there are other pressures on correctional services. We've got overcrowded prisons. We've got a massive COVID pandemic. We know that the prisons were closed before anything else under COVID, so we recognise those. But those are not good reasons to release unrehabilitated people. And in fact, in Minister Lamola's speech, he specifically said that those convicted of femicide and GBV need to specifically be assessed and looked at more intensely than other kinds of offenders, because these interpersonal crimes that affect things like GBV and the lack of respect for young people, lack of respect for women, need to be treated with the dignity afforded to the victims, not with the respect for the rights of the convicted murderer as the primary departure point. So, WAMACA are here today to ensure the voices of the victims are heard in this process, not to debate the rights of convicted murderers. That's for other people to do. We are of the firm opinion that the trial itself, the convicted offender had more influence in the process than the victims. We know because it's beyond a reasonable doubt that it has to be proved. And they continue to make victims appear to be an afterthought in this restorative system. And we are saying there is nothing to restore between the Matthews family and the person who murdered their child. We are not debating that these convicted persons have rights, but as with any rights, there needs to be a balance against the rights of any opposing group. In this case, it is the murdered child of the Matthews family that needs to take precedence in terms of the rights afforded. When we look at the scales of justice and the idea that justice is blind, we feel that our presence is essential in this debate to tip the scales where correctional services are promoting the rights of their inmate without due regard for the victim, in our opinion. We are here to add weight to that voice. And in conclusion, we just want to make our final point very clear. None of us as citizens made a social contract to participate in a predetermined process that releases murderers and rapists who are not rehabilitated nor remorseful back into our communities. I didn't sign up for that. It is not for the murdered victim's family to show the reasons Mr. Moodley should not be released. It is for him and correctional services to show why he should. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you for that. We are just going to introduce Mr. Rob Matthews, father of Leigh Matthews, who's here to represent the whole Matthews family, Leigh's mother and Leigh's sister, surviving sister. Thank you very much, Rob, for being here today. We hand over to you.
Brenda, thank you very much, Luke and your team. We're overwhelmed by the support that we've got and people that have bought into our views on where the criminal justice system is, and also to Peter and his team for their support that they've given us from Eversheds. Has been truly appreciated. In order to give some background to the points that I'd like to discuss and make today, I'd like to just take some headlines that I picked out, and the sad part, there are so many of these headlines that are available, and I just chose a few of them. The Justice Minister in March 2020 made a statement, some flaws in the parole system to be rectified with immediate effect. This is March 2020. The South African parole system has failed child victims, May 2020, by the Minister. Justice Minister Donovan Moodley has reiterated calls by President Ramaphosa that the parole system needs to be asked tough questions about why prisoners are being released. This is May 2020 as well. Most wanted suspect on parole and 2 armed robbers arrested in Limpopo, October 2020. 20-year-old woman killed by her boyfriend who was on parole, having been released from jail 1 month earlier. He had served the minimum required time and completed rehabilitation program. September 2020. Police this week confirmed that one of the men arrested for the murder of farm manager Brendan Horner had been arrested 16 times. This was October 2020. Parolee arrested for child rape at Pretoria Hotel, November 2020. And this, by the way, during the period of activism against women and child abuse. A murderer who killed 75-year-old woman while out on parole, slapped with life sentence, May 2021. and Luke referred to the period during the pandemic where, and I can't get the exact numbers, but somewhere between 14,000 and 19,000 prisoners were allegedly released. And the papers report that more than 100 of those prisoners that had been released had been rearrested. 6 of them arrested for rape, and 6 of them for murder. Notably, I could not find any reference to additional resources being put in place to make sure that those 14,000 people that had been released on parole were going to be under some sort of supervision. I think we have this romantic notion about the movies where you see prisoners released on parole and they have tracking systems and all the rest that actually make sure that these people behave in line with the mandate that they've been given in order to get parole. We don't have such a thing. I'm unable to find that. I've done extensive research. The best I did find that there was a system in place and we hadn't paid for the maintenance of the surveillance, so it fell by the wayside. So if I can give you a little bit of background to Leigh's murder, we had overwhelming support. As a family, we did not realize how many people Leigh's life touched. And so it's to this end that I'm sitting here today with a great team where we would like to make a difference. This is not about Leigh, it's about all the Leighs that are out there. It's about those people that don't have a voice and haven't been able to get to where I am sitting here today to talk about their grief and to talk about their frustrations. It really, really is time that government sat back and those people in charge looked at what's happening and took some decisive steps to rectify things. The talk show can't keep on going. The talk show can't keep on going. When Moodley was sentenced, he got a life sentence. And I must be honest, my family and I thought, well, you know, that's great news. We've now got somebody that's taken off the streets. And in the old South Africa, there was a thing called the death penalty, and we don't subscribe to the death penalty. I think there are too many problems around that area. But what we do believe is that if somebody gets life, it has to be a responsible sentence, and that sentence has to be carried out. There can't be loopholes found along the way to achieve the KRAs of correctional services, and Luke spoke about that, and I feel so strongly about it. This is not a KRA for correctional services. This is KRA for us as citizens of the country. We expect you to look after us, not too worried about looking after the criminals. They put themselves there. We did not put you there. We are trying to live, and 99% of us are solid citizens of the country. We are trying to live a life that is responsible, crime-free, and something that we can add to and contribute to building the country. It is unacceptable that that small minority can enter through a system that allows them back on the streets. So if you think it's just us that was confused about what a life sentence is about, my daughter still receives counselling from a trauma counsellor in the province that she lives. And this person takes on a lot of students that need to do their service and their training. And they spend a lot of their time in the prisons doing the counselling, going part of their learning process. Do you know that when Karen discussed this with her counsellor, she came back and said the same comment that we had, is that the belief is that if you get a life service, you've taken away from society and you're no longer in that position to create carnage and destruction. They did not realize that a life sentence, in fact, is not life. And even more diabolical is that the court will hand out from time to time multiple life sentences. Well, the truth of the matter is that that still falls into the same parameters in terms of access to parole. But I'm not the legal expert in that area. I'm sure Peter can tell us more about that. So I think life sentence, if I'm cynical about this, is a fantastic marketing concept by the authorities to us law-abiding citizens. Because we get told this criminal's got a life sentence. But in fact, life is not life, and I'll get back to that in a moment. I'd like to just take you through our journey, because that could then give you a little bit of an insight into the complexities of trying to keep somebody in jail. And I have a very privileged background. I have some resources, I have some knowledge, and I have a lot of skills. And it has been an absolute nightmare for us to try and find our way through the system and to get somebody to respond to us and to tell us what is happening. To that extent, that's why I ended up at the doorstep of Peter at Evershed and Miranda and Luke to try and get some additional understanding of where we go. Now, how much more difficult is it for 99% of the population of this country? And that's what I'm appealing to, that we can find a way to empower those people, or more so, put the responsibility where the responsibility exists, and that's with correctional services and that whole area of activity. The nightmare for us was quite frightening. Leigh was kidnapped the day after her 21st birthday. And how does this sound? This is really crazy. In October 2004, we had great relief that an offender had been found. I mean, that's like, it's a parent's worst nightmare. You have scenarios in your mind that there are many things that can happen to your children. Murder of your child is not something that should be foremost in your planning of your child's career and future. You should not have to bury your child. So if we go through that roller coaster ride of finding Leigh's body, and by the way, we found Leigh's body, how's this for ironical? We found it on her body on the 21st of July. And we had just come from a church service at her school. We were praying for the safe return of Leigh. And that afternoon, we found her body. And it's just like, wow, how's that juxtaposed in terms of trying to deal with your emotions? So again, the roller coaster, we found her, but wow, we didn't find her alive. And our pain is so many other people's pain out there. It's not just about our pain. It's so many people experience the same. And then we went through, and there was a court hearing, and then Moodley found that he had some problems with that. Do you know that up until 2018, that was the last appeal that Moodley made? He was fighting this all the way from 2005 to 2018. Not once admitting guilt, not once admitting remorse, but finding a way through the justice system. Do you know he studied his LLB? And that studying of his LLB had nothing to do with helping anybody else other than himself to find a way out of his predicament. So the roller coaster ride goes on and on and on. And then in 2017, I was advised that if we want to be part of any future as far as parole hearing or what's happening as far as the potential release of Moodley, we should register that desire with the Department of Correctional Services. Well, I can tell you, you go through the website of Correctional Services. It's out of date. I send mails off to people, the mails bounced. When I eventually found somebody, I have to concede that they were very, very helpful. But it was difficult to get to somebody that would actually give us some input and give us some feedback. The feedback that I got in 2017 was, it might be 2018, that Moodley was eligible for parole in 2030, it was July 2030. So as a family, we parked that to one side because we'd been through the emotional roller coaster of all these court cases. And I said, we can now actually start our healing, that we have a number of years before he comes up for parole, and we can start preparing for that parole. So in 2019, I approached Professor Labaskachny, who's a well-known criminal psychologist, and asked him, would you help us start putting together that information that you think would be pertinent to keeping Moodley in jail if rehabilitation had not taken place? And what does rehabilitation look like? He came back to me and said, Rob, you know that Moodley's up for a parole hearing early in 2020. I said, that can't be right. I've got confirmation from somebody in Correctional Services that told me the exact month and year as to when this would happen. So we went back into the system, jumped through a whole lot of loops again, and I found that there were two cases that made a big difference to Moodley and his parole hearing. The unintended benefit, I believe, that Moodley got out of these cases is diabolical. The first one was the case versus the state versus Pala. And in that...
Well, we have to come out of that. That is a briefing by the family of the slain university student, Leigh Matthews, who was killed in 2004. They are addressing media and addressing the prospect that her killer, Donovan Moodley, could be up for some kind of a parole hearing. We know that the Department of Correctional Services is denying that that was going to happen today. There had been signals that there would be a parole hearing for Donovan Moodley, but the department denying that, and the family weighing in there about the prospect and even the idea of parole for Donovan Moodley, basically rejecting it and saying that he has shown no remorse and venting out a number of issues that are of concern in their interactions with the department. You'll remember that story from 2004 that really shook the country, right, and left everyone who's a parent's worst nightmare. A university student kidnapped, ransom demanded, and the family making arrangements to pay that ransom. But despite all of that, the student ending up being killed. She was a Bond University student at the time, was Leigh Matthews. So her birthday, she would have been 38, her birthday coming up in the next few days, and the family marking that, but also at the same time addressing this talk of a parole hearing, which, as I say, the department is rejecting, that that's not up for discussion at the moment.